Well, I think we all know that with coronavirus, there's a lot of companies that have been pushing to stay home. Which I think first I want to just identify that the way that we're thinking about it, I think a lot of you as well, is there's the personal health aspect, but there's also the community service aspect of making sure that we encourage our team members to stay home to avoid the spread in the United States. And so I think making sure that we communicate that clearly to our companies and to our employees. We've personally had some questions about like, well, hey, but we still want to go in the office, and we just took an approach to say everybody's not going to the office, and this is partially to help our community not spread coronavirus. So I think it's an important time to really communicate values and community service and doing good, and then from there identifying how we're all going to continue to work successfully so that as much as possible our whole economy doesn't shut down. Like remote work can do a lot to allow all of us to continue to be productive. And I don't know about all of you, but we have a lot of our customers that are really uncomfortable with not doing on-site meetings and not doing office meetings. They think like, how could we possibly be productive if we're not in the same room? And so for us, we're trying to take an active role in demonstrating to our customers how you can do remote work and how you can collaborate online with the tools that are available to us today. And I think we're in a new space. I mean, I think over the last 5 to 10 years, the tools for online collaboration have come so far that I think a lot of companies tried to allow remote work in the early 2000s, and it was difficult, and they had a lot of times where it didn't work out with employees. But we're in a whole different world today. So I think that utilizing the great tools, Zoom has done an incredible job with video quality and the collaborative tools that they have, and demonstrating that there's a new way to work remotely where we really can collaborate. People can stay engaged, and you're not questioning like, oh, is my employee just sitting at home watching TV? Because we have collaborative tools where you can be online in Slack, you can be on video chats, you have collaborative documents where you can see when people are working. It's a real opportunity, I think, for the whole country right now, well, actually the whole world, to move to a new space where we can really embrace remote work. And I think right now we're doing it because there's a real community driving force. But I also think the time is right where we're really prepared for it. And there's companies like GitLab that have the whole process laid out and a real demonstration on how to do that. So I was excited to see Christopher, speak up and say that they already had these resources. It's something for Limelight that we've grown from the day one, being a very remote company, and we've always embraced it and tried to build really great culture around a company that's fully remote or mostly remote. And I feel like we're doing a fairly good job with it. Our employees love where they work, and they love the flexibility of being remote. And now there's an even bigger driving force to support it. So with that, I'll turn it over to Christopher. And Christopher and Mech, I'd like to thank you guys for all the resources you guys are presenting and have available to everybody.
Thanks. Yes, I'm Mech Citri, Director of Quality Engineering at GitLab. And if you think working remote is challenging, we are the quality engineering department and we do it remotely. So I'm happy to share what we've learned so far. And before I pass on to Christopher, I think we share the values page also. I think a lot of our effectiveness from GitLab as a company has this interlaced back to our values, like always write things down, go to asynchronous as you can, because synchronous is go to asynchronous when you can write things down. You don't have to have a sync meeting because that is expensive. And then measuring results, not hours. I think that's what Alan brought up. Like if you worry about your employees not working, you measure results and take the hour out of that equation, and then that seems to be helping us. With that, I'll pass it on to Christopher. Thank you.
Thanks. So I'm going to start off with a little bit of my own personal journey. People have been talking about working remotely, particularly in the last, say, 5 years, probably 5 to 10 years. I actually worked at Cisco Systems, which is a networking company here in the US that provides a lot of capabilities. And they actually had telepresence in the early 2000s. And what's interesting about it is, Cisco, a multinational company, you have that remote experience of multiple offices that you had to work with and teams working across various spans and time zones. So I feel like over the years, I've learned a lot about different ways to work. Just strictly from the perspective of seeing telepresence and the capabilities. Now that we've gotten much more ubiquitous with the tools and the capabilities, it really has become a case where you can consider it kind of more holistically and say, okay, how do we want to do it? Some of the people at GitLab talk about it in terms of what's your optimal organization? And an all in office is obviously optimal. And then there's like a hybrid model where you maybe have some folks working remotely and some people coming into the office. And then you have the optimal and that's kind of the dip. So it's kind of the way to think of it is it's the dip. So you may work suboptimally, but that may work for your organization. And then there's everybody working remotely, which is super important to understand. Is that actually is the other point. I wouldn't necessarily say that working in the office or working remotely are one is better than the other. I really do like working remotely in an all remote fashion. But I think it really just depends on the culture and the capabilities that a company sets up. As Mech mentioned, GitLab in particular has some highly opinionated views on certain things. It's an example working async and the capabilities of it. Another thing that Etienne just talked about was the fact that we set up this Google Doc for people to basically start entering information. In a typical GitLab conversation, you'll see constant collaboration going on in there while somebody's talking. So as an example, I encourage people to go in there, put in their questions, or if they want to, the last thing I want to talk about is the current crisis. And just think in terms of the fact that a lot of people probably don't have the same capabilities in their home office or even in their home because they don't even have a home office. So that's one of the key aspects is if you're looking to transition people is to really think in terms of being understanding if, for instance, their internet connection is at a lower rate and they have a lag associated with it. These are things that over time, GitLab has been able to basically catch with individuals and basically address basically through constant feedback. But in a current situation like this, it's going to be really hard just from that aspect of it. So because of that, I just put some high-level questions in the document, and I'm just going to kind of highlight why I think they're important to ask as a either CTO or senior leader in your organization. So, the first one I'm going to start off with is are you doing this because of the current crisis or a long-term goal or project? We could be protracted for a number of months associated with this, but if your organization is thinking that, hey, we're going to do this for 4 weeks and then we're going to all be back in the office, I actually would ironically enough, I wouldn't treat it as an all remote experience. I would treat it as a crisis management experience. Think in terms of what are the minimal things that you want to change in the short term and make sure that those are the only things that you're thinking about versus a long-term objective. Now, if you say, look, we're going to actually probably be in this for 8 months, we'd really like to think about this. We may even think about making a smaller lease on our office that saves the company some money and maybe gives us a return. Then I would have a much different approach to this in regards to, okay, start really thinking about holistically, how do you want to do this? Are there people that you potentially have in your organization that you could have them focus solely on this activity for a short period of time, even if it's a couple of weeks to do some of the things that we suggest? Because it's really key to that aspect of it. So that's number one, is make sure your senior leadership is on the same page as far as, are you in crisis management? Are you in an all remote experiment or some version of that associated with it? The next thing is what are the pieces that you have to have in a common workspace? Everybody who sells all remote forgets that there's things like manufacturing that are really hard to do at home, though you can do some manufacturing at home. I've seen quite a number of people produce beer in their houses as an example, but by and large, there are large scale activities that may prevent you in the business. Another example is face-to-face meetings and sales. A green screen behind people, and that may be the first purchase you give people for Zoom, is actually putting a green screen so that they actually can hide what's behind them, is a great example of that, where you may want to have that. We have a number of people at GitLab who actually will present behind them what looks like an office space, and it really makes it seem like they're actually working that way. To that end, we also have a number of people who go into offices and co-working spaces, as an example, and they provide we provide that as a reimbursement associated with our all remote environment. The reason we do that is because it's hard for some folks to really find a space in their house related to the fact that they have young children or they just don't have the space locality wise for a desk and capabilities associated with it that they need. So that's another example of something to be thinking about in that space. And then, what are the tools? It used to be that when you did agile software development, which is kind of my expertise, we used Post-it notes on a board, and that changed into Jira, Trello boards, and of course GitLab for capabilities associated with that. So I really encourage you to think in terms of what are the tools you currently have in your stack. And I wouldn't recommend changing everything, but I would think in terms of if there's other tools that you could potentially bring to the table that may help folks over this period of time. Do it in a fashion where they kind of can consume it in a short term associated with that. And then last but not least, or two more actually, the other one that I think is what are the barriers do you see folks working remotely? You know, as an example, if you have policies around VPN and VPNing in, you're probably going to put a heavy load on that service if all of a sudden everybody is working outside the office, unless it's being used that way in the office. So it really starts to think in those terms. Similarly, if people don't have high screen or high definition screens at their homes, that's probably important to their job if they're doing, say, software development or any other tools associated with it. This is just as an aside, but I have a high definition camera that's on the top of my screen. Why don't I not use the Mac camera that's off to my left? Well, two reasons. One, it gives me a completely different profile, makes me a little bit heavier. But then the other part is it's a lower definition capability, and it's a much better experience to have it kind of just from that. So thinking in terms of that, if you can afford it, is the tools to give people to be successful associated with that. And then if you have anything that's going to break policy, just make sure you understand that from that perspective. And then what are the minimal things? GitLab believes heavily in iterative development, which means doing the absolute minimum or MVC capabilities associated with a given activity. Really think in terms of what are the small wins that you want to have up front to give people, because it's going to be a real change for some folks. Going into the office gives you a lot of things like, for instance, coffee chats that are up front, and examples of just yelling over a divider to say, hey, I need help on this. Setting up a culture that basically gives you that capability, either via Slack channels or other things. Those are the kinds of things that you want to think about. So it's really key to think about, okay, what do I want to do in the short term to try to change policies around it.
About whiteboarding tool, and I posted a link on our awesome UX department. They did actually an async sketching session, and they just use boring tools where people just took pictures of their whiteboard or paper. You don't have to spend that much money. The key is that they have specific instructions. So format your sketch into 4 sections, and everybody does that. And I'll share the link here in the chat as well. And that has been working really well so far. Kudos to our UX department.
Thanks for pulling that up. I would have not been able to pull that up on the fly. One of the things that to call out there is another kind of philosophy we have is boring solutions. If you're in a situation where you say, hey, we need that collaboration, getting on and talking to people, but then steering the camera at a piece of paper where they're drawing is totally an acceptable way to do that. Or taking a shot with your phone and then uploading it so that people can see it is another way to do that. We sometimes refer to GitLab as having awkward silence, where all of a sudden you'll see a pause where people will actually be doing activities in line, either writing in documentation or things like that. And that's another key aspect is that's another change that you may see in kind of an all work remote culture is activity has to happen sometimes to either update information or documentation associated with it. We actually pause to go do that work for a much more continuous flow. So it's something to be thinking about there. Cool. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen with the remote work emergency plan of what to do and where to start. So this is kind of a key aspect to things. So one of the key aspects we think is to start from the top. You're part of leadership, and you really need to have a leadership team that is kind of embracing this. So maybe establishing a remote leadership team is important to this aspect, particularly around daily communication, as well as thinking in terms of what are the things that we view as the highest priority based on the current situation we're in. That's probably the number one thing. The next recommendation is to establish a handbook. We obviously have a handbook that's online and as a website and is constantly updated through merge requests associated with that. This could be as simple as just create a Google Doc and people put their content in there, depending on what the level of investment you may have. But being able to document kind of steps and processes around things is super important. If you go look at a lot of GitLab documentation, what you'll find is literally a demonstration of how to do something with a step-by-step process associated with it, which helps people, particularly who are not in the same time zone as other people working. A lot of our folks work 12 hours apart from each other, as an example. Communication is super critical in this situation, particularly if your culture is a culture that has specific ways of engaging. A good example of that is we have a definition of how we communicate in Slack. that actually my wife has used in her job to kind of use in the nonprofit arena. So it's a good way to kind of say, okay, what are your expectations around this? And this could speak to your culture. Some cultures, Slack is supposed to be a synchronous communication where it's like, so you say, hey, I want some of your time, and then you collaborate closely for a bit, and then everybody pulls away from it. Other environments like ours, it's supposed to be treated as an async. So you may put something in there, and you may not get a response for hours associated with that response. So establishing how you want folks to engage and communicate is an important part of that, as well as how you want to communicate globally. We've gotten to the size now where we don't have daily meetings, a company-wide call every meeting, but in a smaller company, particularly during this period of time, it may be beneficial to set up that daily sync for even 15 minutes to do announcements, talk about what's going on, and even coffee chat with breakout rooms associated with that. And then minimize your tool stack. Don't try to change too much too quickly, because you'll definitely feel a lot of pain associated with that. The next one, it says to drive cultural change. I think I want to be careful here. This is not to suggest that you change your culture, but working remotely is a experience, and it's different from an in-office experience. And you as a management team have to think in terms of how do you drive to change that experience for people associated with that. In particular, if you have a hybrid environment, the number one feedback most people give in a hybrid environment is that the playing field is not level. People who work in an office versus people who work remotely, the people oftentimes who are working remotely feel like they don't have a level playing field, either in communication or raising things up to associate with that. In those situations, oftentimes it's recommended to basically level that playing field either by forcing everybody to be on a Zoom rather than having a conference room where half the team is and then everybody else is all remote. Similarly, you're going to have these things kind of pop up as teams start transitioning into the stage where people will give you feedback around, hey, I feel like I'm being excluded or I'm being kept out of a discussion. You have to really push hard for the aspect of making sure that that field is level so that person feels like they can equally contribute to the efforts associated with your organization. And that's a super key aspect. The next topic I want to talk about is just our starter guide. This is really a starter guide for individuals, and if you want to give this to your ICs, this is kind of a good way to think about it. The number one reason why people why management typically likes people in the office is two reasons. One, there's a trust aspect to their workforce that they feel like they need them physically in the office. Actually, I should say three reasons. That trust aspect. The second reason is because there's something that they physically have to do in the office that makes it important for them to be there. And the third is it's an environment where people can actually be productive. And this is important when you have folks transition to home, is making sure that they have an environment set up where they can achieve that focus. There's this notion, somewhat important to kind of talk about, which is I'm going to work in a coffee shop and it's going to be great. Well, for some people, that's extremely distracting. And I just want to call out that that's one of the aspects that we kind of view as important, especially in this crisis. It's important to think in terms of if people are sick, you really want them to rest and recover. You don't necessarily want them working. So treat it as one, giving them an environment where they can achieve focus, but then also making sure that they're capable of being productive in that. And then separating work and life. A lot of people will have a hard time unplugging in this capability. So you want to basically think in terms of burnout. Another one is to engage people even though you're remote. I am constantly hit up for Zoom chats, and /Zoom in Slack is a great tool to basically do an impromptu discussion with folks. And it's a very important tool even in the current environments. We do have some pitfalls that we've run into. So things that we think are important, though you're free to give us feedback if you think that you actually could do this in this environment. So number one is don't replicate the in-office experience remotely. That may be good as a starting point, just to transition in an existing organization. But if you continue that process, you won't actually get a lot of the benefits associated with working all remote. So that's the first piece of advice associated with that. And then look for other resources. We obviously put together a package, but there's also additional things that you could be looking for. There are other great companies out there that have done remote work that publish information. So go look for that information and kind of do it. And This is a key aspect that's big to our culture. We try to be meeting light. I would argue that meetings are about less than 10% of my schedule. One that doesn't include one-on-ones and other impromptu discussions, but meetings themselves where a group is meeting are extremely light in our organization. The reason why that is because we've gotten very efficient from that perspective. So thinking in terms of trying to do that in a virtual environment with async communication and other pieces of tooling that you can do associated with that. Let me see here if there's one other one. Yeah, this is another key aspect I want to call out is it's not going to happen overnight. It takes people time to transition associated with that.
One thing I saw on the news last night was some epidemiologists saying that some people are thinking this is maybe a 2-week thing, but it could turn into a 3-month, 4-month thing. So without sort of any sort of official information, that longer term approach may raise a bunch of situations, right? Disagreements, conflict, plummeting productivity. You may even have to fire someone, hire someone. Any comments on that?
Yeah, good question. It's an interesting question of if you transition your company to all remote, some people are not set up for that environment, and giving active coaching around that is super important. GitLab's kind of overall philosophy is we do one-on-ones weekly, which means that our spans of control can only grow so large. So as an example, if you had, say, 20 people reporting to you, it's really hard to do one-on-ones weekly just from a time consideration associated with that. The other aspect is that you are going to have some folks who really just aren't ready for this, either because they socially need to go into an office or because they just can't find a way to be productive. And, it's an unfortunate part of this. A lot of people think a lot of people at GitLab believe that all remote is the future. I think it is in some companies and some organizations. I don't think it's going to be where everybody's going to end up, because I think there are definitely folks that fit into the population of, have to be in an office, have to always be in an all remote, and there's kind of in the middle, which is probably where I am, which is I could go either way associated with it. We take performance management very seriously. The tooling is usually how we think about it in terms of that, though generally we don't like to try to look at individuals on a day-to-day basis around the tooling. But if we're seeing a drop in productivity from someone, that's usually what we'll do, is kind of go back and look at that, and we'll try to coach them on that to basically say, hey, your deliverables are falling behind, or expectations are clearly not being met. And setting those expectations in written form are super important to us. So it's a lot of the same tactics that you would use in the office, but it's treating those in one-on-one conversations and really trying to coach people around that.
Yeah, I think what comes to mind for me is, as the technical lead, I may have collaborative skills that could translate well into Zoom. If I have VPs or directors who part of their deliverables requires collaboration on them managing their teams, and they aren't doing well in the remote environment, to me, that could lead to sort of could be a bit of a domino effect.
Yeah, that's a good point. Most of the tools I feel like have gotten to the point where being in a room with somebody versus being on Zoom are very much the same experience. So I haven't seen too much where I've seen a person in management who couldn't manage remotely, but could manage in the office, maybe is the best way to say it. I'm sure there are examples of that, but it just hasn't been something that I've run into. So it's been a little bit less on that from that perspective. You had a general question, which is GitLab hires to ensure workers can handle the requirements of delivering as a remote worker. How do you hire for remote friendly workers? Not everyone is suitable. So there's two ways that we kind of do this. One is, as an example for individual contributors, we actually have an interviewing process that is somewhat longer, in particular because we don't we don't try to schedule everything on a single day like you would have in, say, an in-office environment. The other thing is we actually have them use our tooling to actually interview. So as an example, if you're an IC working on the back end, we actually have a test that they take, which consists of an MR merge, where part of it is written, part of it they have to implement, and part of it they have to give feedback about improvements associated with. So it's a collaboration, and it consists of three parts. One, take-home work, which they do in the MR. Second part is a collaboration session where they basically talk with one of the other engineers on the team. And then the third part is assessment, essentially, how did they do on each of those parts? In most of those conversations, we can get a pretty good feel of like, were they really good at addressing the MR, but did they suffer when they were actually working in the Zoom environment, and how do they communicate associated with that? The other thing we kind of look at is things around like how do they have their environment set up for the interview. It's not necessarily a formal part of the process, but we do have a can work remotely question. So one is people who have done it in some form, either hybrid or otherwise. That's a point up for them. And then the other part is do they have the right things set up in their environment to basically run a successful interview? If they can't do that, frankly, that's usually a sign that they're probably not going to, at least at the for this try, not going to be successful in that fashion.
If I may chime in here, it's along the same line as what Christopher said. Our interview process mimics the way we work. So if you apply at GitLab, you're going to work with us asynchronously. So the interviews are spread out over a few days, maybe in a week, and there's sync and async interactions, and we evaluate the performance based on that, and also their polishedness in communication. Because if they don't write things down, they don't have clear bottom line communication. That's a flag on communication that tells us that they won't be successful. And the other thing is, remote work experience is a nice to have in our requirements. As long as they can pass these gates, I believe people can be successful at being remote.
Are you in favor of open? Maybe you said this earlier, Christopher. In favor of open Zoom sessions, like 8-hour Zoom sessions?
That's one thing that you don't see too much at GitLab. We do have places that you do have that. As an example, if we have an operational situation in our infrastructure team, they will have continuously running rooms. In the Slack channel, you'll see it up in the corner. And depending on who's working the issue at a given moment, and depending on the severity of it, you'll either have the room open consistently. I have worked in environments where the hybrid environment is the classic one, where if you have some people who are in an office in a locality, as best example that may be is if the outbreak has stopped in one area, and people are going in the office, but in another area people are staying home because of restrictions. One argument would be is to keep everybody home. The other argument is if you're trying to get back to some semblance and give people some semblance of normalcy, do that as quickly as possible. So in that environment, I actually encourage the all open, like the conference room is open, because there's a natural tendency in a lot of environments where people have worked in an office to forget about people and just not include them. And this is one way that you can do it, literally, is to just have that going. So it's not necessarily something we use, but I would be in favor of it in a culture where that provides basically a leg up to make sure people are getting included. So the serendipitous conversations, you still see those happen a lot in Slack for us, where basically people will engage. We're a strong believer in transparency. We actually had a debate yesterday of, is transparency needed to be an all remote company? And I actually argued against it, though I love our transparency policy at GitLab. So you'll see a lot of conversations happen in Slack where they're on channels associated with, say, two engineers talking to each other, or two managers talking to each other. And people have the flexibility to really join any conversations they want associated. So that's one that's kind of there is basically that aspect of it. The other way that we've really kind of gotten that is if people start having a conversation, let's say they're in Slack and they say, we really need to get to a conversation live, oftentimes people will record that conversation, assuming it's not involving confidential information or things of that nature. So it's a key to think in terms of, when does it become super important to stop going back and forth in Slack because it's taking too much time, and go to a more active communication. But then it'll also record that for people to potentially either watch later on, because if you have like a workforce that's across the globe, there may be people asleep, and you're not going to ask them to basically wake up for a conversation. What you're going to do though is provide them that information at some later point. I really like video being on, because one, if you're going to be in a meeting, you want them engaged. You don't want people multitasking too much where they're not paying attention. We still get that at GitLab. Any company's going to do that, especially with everybody being so busy. But I'm a big fan of the video being on. Now, the one exception I'll say to that is if you have company announcements in the morning, and you have over 50 to 100 people on a call like this. It doesn't necessarily, everybody having their video on doesn't necessarily reap rewards. But any size, let's say less than 12 to 20 folks, I recommend getting the video on, excluding somebody either eating lunch, which is definitely something I've noticed. Nobody likes to eat lunch together on a phone call for whatever reason, though they love to do it in person. The other exception is if they feel like there's something going on that they don't want people to see. Obviously, those would be reasons.
I can add to that facet as well. At GitLab, I don't think we have a strong requirement that you have to be turning your video on. We respect the privacies of each team members, but it's highly encouraged, especially for one-on-ones, because that's a safe space that you have with your direct reports, and the rest is you manage your own comfort level, for lack of a better term, but you want to keep it on or off.
We also embrace heavily traffic going on. You can't see it right now because I think my family knows that I'm on a call with 64 of my close personal friends. But oftentimes you'll see family members walk by, or you'll see young kids come in and ask questions. We've had our VP of engineering, Eric Johnson, has had occasionally his 2-year-old daughter sitting on his lap during some calls, as an example.
Yeah, I was going to say, we strongly encourage video on, and we started doing that about 6 months ago, and the engagement on meetings has just completely changed. So I would say if you don't currently do video on, maybe just try for a week to say like, hey, everyone, let's try to all turn our video on and see the difference. I think you can all understand the difference between seeing someone's face, seeing reactions, seeing hand gestures is way different than just hearing a phone call. And so our meetings have actually changed where, we'll all have everybody in the screen, and so like, oh, I can tell that you don't like what I just said. Like, do you have something you wanted to say? And you can interact more. And I want to just double down on the casual work environment where everyone needs to be communicated that it's okay. We know that you're at home, and some of you may not have a dedicated space. So there's going to be situations where your kid might run in, a dog might bark, and with that, it's keep yourself on mute, unmute when you want to talk, and we're not going to hear the background noise. It's okay for stuff to be happening in the background. Sharing your experience as far as like, your kid comes in, like a quick introduction, if it's a casual meeting, can actually help build community within the company. And so I think that for us, video is super important. And I really think that everyone should encourage video on all the time. And actually, we do our all hands, and we have about 100 people. And it's an incredible experience because all the videos are on. And so you can actually, for me, during the all hands, I'm going around and kind of watching people and seeing how people react to different things. And it gives you that experience of actually being in an all hands where, if you're presenting, you can look out and see all the faces. So we have screenshots that I think we even posted one to LinkedIn, where it's a threaded together image of like 100 people in Zoom, because you got to scroll through multiple pages. But I think there's value even in that, because there's the community feeling of everybody being there. It really makes a difference between just a bunch of people dialed in.
I just posted a link. We actually have instructions for this in our handbook, and to echo, it states that try to have your video on all times. And if you read through the sub bullets, we make it acceptable, saying it's okay to eat, just have your mic off. So like to these etiquettes that you ingrain into instructions, and again, write things down. Like if it's written down, it's so easy to refer to. But yeah, I'm sharing it there.
I think you've got to be really explicit about expectations with video, because there's so many people. Like we had one just the other day where it was like, no, I'm afraid to turn my video on. Like I don't want you to see my background. And so you have to really set that expectation that it's okay. Like we know that you're at a coffee shop or you're at your house. Like it's more important that you are participating with us and that you're here than worrying about what you look like or what your background is. You got to think about it more like being in the office. And I think the more you build that culture, one thing that we found is people have said, I was working from home for years and I didn't care what I look like. Now all of a sudden when I wake up in the morning, I'm like getting ready for work. And then I'm on video. And I think that changes the mentality for the positive in a lot of ways.
I know from my experience transitioning to work from home, this was more so when I was self-employed, which, made it, or I had a tiny startup company of like 2 people. So I was wearing all my hats, and I've tried to remember it as I've led remote teams, is that for a while I was way overworking myself because I had the ability to start working as I rolled out from bed. So I would like wake up, kind of look at my email and be like, oh no, and like start responding to things before I even got out of bed, and then like get up and start doing things and such. And all of a sudden it's like 1 or 2 o'clock in the afternoon and I'm filthy and I have low blood sugar and it's, really not a good thing. And so I forced myself to do a routine where I wouldn't look at anything work related until after I'd gotten up and went to the coffee shop to get coffee. Formerly I made coffee at home, but by walking 3 blocks to get a cup of coffee, that made me get up, take a shower, get dressed, move a little bit, get back, and then like sit down intentionally to work. And that was a big transition for me, and one I try to share with people who are not used to working remotely is like setting aside times and spaces where you're going to start intentionally and stop intentionally and be done, like leaving the office, sorts of things, showing up at the office. When you live in your office, it can be harder to do that, so you have to be intentional about it.
I think it's important to use the tools that you have. So like Slack and Google Calendar have the ability to set work hours so that you ensure that people are following your work hours. For me, it's 8:15 to 5:30. And people will see if they try to schedule something outside of there, or if they send me a Slack notification, it'll tell you like, oh, he's offline. And then also, I think it's really important to have that discipline with yourself as far as taking the lunch break and like actually taking a lunch break, get out of your office, go do something, and take a full hour. Also, when you're scheduling meetings and participating in meetings, making sure that you're allowing for bio breaks. Depending on the structure, for me as a CTO, my day is filled with meetings. And a lot of times they're literally back to back. So allowing for that time where people can actually go take a bio break, go grab a snack, whatever, making sure you're allowing for that if you're in that kind of condensed structure.
That really speaks to heart. We just did a workshop with our managers on blocking calendars because it could creep the other way as well, where if you're working from home, you put your desk next to your bed, and it can creep easy into like 16-hour workdays and 18-hour workdays, which I am also a offender of that. So block time off. And one of the things that came up with my managers is time is like energy. It has to go somewhere. So you need to make time for your family. You need to make time for your lunch. And if it's off, then please turn off. Otherwise, you're going to burn out as well. That's the other side of running really high speed in our remote environment.
At some point, want to go a little more sort of leadership, dealing with, for instance, if someone disappears, they're not answering Slack, they didn't think to turn on this, or they didn't answer their emails. When we are in these leadership situations, when does one escalate a situation where, okay, it's the 3rd time I've tried to this, and clearly you are really loving this remote work because you're not getting stuff done. There is the one-on-one and the coaching, but assuming that there's sort of, you're noticing a downward trend, are there ways that you escalate and do that? I'm interested to know around leadership again, if some employees are like, hey man, I'm not afraid of the virus. I'm just going to do stuff. And I think you guys are all panicking for no reason. I was in a situation this week where someone said, oh, don't worry. A few of us are still going to meet in person. So don't worry about it. And I had to say, no, actually, I prefer for you not to meet in person at all and for everyone to be remote. And what I had to say was, I'd like to consider the people who are remote to not feel left out because they're not in the room with you. And so if everyone is remote, then there's this meritocracy. But just if we can kind of just go to sort of CTO leadership level and dealing with those nuances around managing people who aren't quite falling in line, sort of those types of situations.
Yeah, I'm going to be extremely transparent on this one. So this is an area that I think we all, as a company and as maybe a movement, have to be aware that we're still working on it. I think that as leadership, what you have to think in terms of, at least from my perspective, is setting expectations. As an example, we have a pretty tight policy around if you're going to be out because of illness or vacation. We do have a PTO policy, which pretty much says you can take unlimited PTO. Though there's obviously some constraints around that, but we don't manage to a certain number of days or anything of that nature. You need to communicate that with your manager, and your manager has to agree that that's appropriate, and you need to give adequate notice so that they're aware of it. Though in the case of illness, obviously it would be the same day. But if you're going to be out for, say, a week, you should be given some amount of pre-notice around that, and your manager should agree to that. Not that we would deny any vacation, but that's just part of the policy. And similarly, you should be updating your your Slack channel. We use Slack, so you update it via the tooling to basically say these are the days I'm out, and notifying people around that, so that when you don't respond to things of that nature. As far as performance goes, I think it's just really, really clear expectation setting, written down, that generally gets us 9/10 of the way there. And then for people who are not seeing that as, hey, this is my opportunity to be in this environment, that I don't have to work in this environment, that they quickly learn that, no, this is still a job, and there's still expectations, and I still have things to do associated with it. Alan, you may have tips and tricks on your side, or Mac as well.
Well, I think we've talked a lot about it, and it's in the document as well. I think it's a lot around company objectives, providing values, transparency, and performance management, and a lot of communication. I think you've got to over communicate, because you're not going to like pass their office in the hallway, right? So you've got to actually proactively reach out. We also have one-on-ones on a weekly basis. So depending on your management structure, making sure that somebody's connecting with them on a very regular basis. And then also work being very objective driven, right? So it's like for us, I very rarely have questions of how somebody's producing, because nearly everybody is producing outcomes that are impacting other people. And obviously for development, that's easy, right? You've got your PRs, and you've got your Jira tickets. For product, it's similar. But there can be other ones where you've got managers that maybe it's a little bit more scattered as far as what's being delivered on a regular basis. But I think that very regular communication and transparency in the company, I think, goes a long way. Making sure everyone aligns on where they're going. And I think this isn't something that you're going to find immediately, but for us, I think it gets back to the hiring, because you end up hiring people that thrive in this type of environment. So I think that could be something to address now, is that you may have a struggle when you're shifting your company. You've got a bunch of people that are used to an office environment. So I think you're going to have to over-invest with those people when they're going remote, to really support them, and to over-communicate, and to probably recognize there's going to be a productivity loss just in the time that you're going to be spending over-communicating with them, checking in with them, allowing them to get the remote environment set up. But if you haven't already done it, I think it's an opportune time to have a very clear document that you and the employee can agree on, is like, this is what I expect from you. This is what success looks like. Do you agree? Like, are these reasonable expectations? Do you think you can perform to them? And then how are we going to be measuring that? And how often will we check in? Having that agreement, like a contract between you and every employee, is really good. If you don't have that, if you haven't done that, one thing that we're doing in one of our organizations right now that might be an easy start, is that we've actually given everybody their job description that they were hired to, and we're asking the employee to review it and see how it aligns with what they're actually doing. And then we're going to go through a process where we actually refine their job description and then turn it into success criteria for that group. So that might be someplace to start, because you probably have a job description that you hired them from. And you may find that actually what you hired and then what you're asking them to do are not aligned at all. And that's not a great place to start. So it's good to get aligned on that first.
That's just great. I'm going to try to answer this into two facets. There's also point five in the doc that touches on this as well. So the first part is they can work remote, but they're scared. So I think supporting them, and there's going to be a period of unlearning new things. And full transparency, GitLab is my first all remote job. It takes like a month and 2 months getting out of that comfort zone. But then if you get it to work, it just all makes sense because a number of these should be doing, even though you're not remote, like writing things down, all this etiquette, even though you have attend remote the call from different rooms, like the same manner and everything falls into play. The other is real underperformance. This is raised by Julian in point 8.2 and also point 13. We have a really clear underperformance guidelines of how we set it. And we lean on managers of one, as what Alan and Christopher said, setting expectations. You are your own manager. And that lessens the load of us as managers checking in every day. Like you're supposed to self-update status. And if it's on the board, it's replicated everywhere. It's just clear to everyone what the progress is. So managers of one, making sure they update it. And for us at GitLab, we're on one single stack. So it's really easy to look at the productivity of one person because everything's in one product. I'm going to talk more about on point 13. So underperformance, it's really clear from the get-go. This is the expectations. Everybody, as part of onboarding, reads this page. Like if your manager is coaching you, like you're treading in that area. And if you're not improving, you're on the PDP plan, and then not improving, you're on the PIP, and then you may get terminated. So it's really clear in setting expectations.
The thing to note, which Etienne gets to yours, is how do you manage managers in this environment? There's expectations around job description and those aspects, but then there's also team expectations. And what we found works really well is basically, because obviously we're an engineering organization, is metrics-based performance analysis. So I'm going to share a screen real quick here just to kind of give a flavor for this, which is near and dear to my heart. I'm a director of development. So MR rate or merge request rate is super important. This graph on the right is actually how the red line is how many employees we've hired over the last 18 months. And then the purple line is essentially the number of MRs that actually produced on the right side associated with that. Now, to note here, there's a little drop here. That's because we reorged and basically moved some of the staff out associated with that. So that's the reason why you see a dip here is basically creating a separate infrastructure organization. Then we convert that essentially into a rate. And basically, I'm held accountable every month to basically showing why the rate changes. So as an example, this dip back here is because we had an offsite where we were gone for a week, and I wasn't here at the time. So this is historical data, but you may actually have historical data that you can kind of look at to kind of get a feel for this as far as what expectation setting is. Similarly, this dip here is because we went from a 2 code base where we had deduplication to a single code base solution because of our open source solution between a community edition and enterprise edition. We basically combined it into a single enterprise edition solution. So we've been working on getting back. We've been successful in getting back to a previous rate. February was a little bit lower because we have less working days, so you got to like those. But what I just did in there is I explained what the reasoning was behind it, and that's the key aspect here. Is it's less about the exact numbers and holding people accountable to numbers, but being able to explain precisely what's going on in a situation and where it is. But if you manage managers in that way to basically manage that performance, that gives you an opportunity to basically have those rich, robust conversations around what's going on in the organization. That's extremely important right now because we want to be compassionate. If people are sick, they should really not work. And that's going to affect productivity, full stop. But we should be expecting managers to be able to explain that and to kind of understand that, because that's key to that aspect as well. Because there's a fine line between being sick and not being able to function in this environment. And those are the two distinctions that we want to make associated with it.
I think that last point's an important one to set expectations on, because what we've found is that more often than not, we have team members that are sick and working because they can sit in their bed and they can code. And so I think clearly setting expectations around, what a manager is expecting if you're not feeling well, if you're sick. Do you want them to like try to work? Do you want them to fully rest and get better and come back? Which leads me to the other point I wanted to make, which is not to forget to manage the person. It's easy to look at the metrics and to manage their job description and all that, but I think it's really important in a remote environment to check in on the person. How are they doing as an individual? Check in. How's your family? Do you have anything that's impacting you? Because, is your mom sick, or is your dog at the vet and you spent $3,000 on vet bills that you didn't expect, or whatever? There's always those things that I think in a office space, it's easier to like check in on people and you have the conversation as you're walking down the hall or at the water cooler or whatever. It's important not to forget to manage the person as an individual and really check in on their own their mental health, their family's health, etc.
Yeah, the thing that comes to mind for me is that desire for connection, and I am seeing a lot in on Twitter about beers over Zoom, and I think I saw a guy start a app called ZoomBeers.com. But yeah, maintaining that connection and checking in with people. I'm wondering if Alan, if pairing people and saying, listen, during this time, we're all remote. Can we create triads or dyads and say, hey, you check in with each other, maybe that extra step that you now are doing because you are remote, that maybe you would not have done in your normal day to day, but hey, each one has a buddy that we kind of check in on. Does that something similar to that?
Yeah, well, I was gonna say, going back to your beers on Zoom first, we actually do coffee breaks. Our HR manager implemented that, where there's actually scheduled coffee breaks where there is a Zoom session that everybody can join, and it's intended to be a casual session to just like, hey, let's hop on Zoom and like let's just talk about stuff that's not work. And people will actually do a little coffee break so that they can have a chance to socialize a little bit because we are all remote. I love the idea of the pairing up, Etienne. I think that can actually help reduce some of the pressure on the remote managers, especially if that's new to everybody, to make sure that you kind of have buddies to check in on one another, and to form that so that there's an expectation there of kind of looking out for one another.
Yeah, so this is again written down documentation, clear expectation setting, but I'd recommend setting a policy to have employees inform the manager. You know, you can do something like what some of my employees do, which is not only do they do it in Slack, but they also put it out of office with sick in their Google Calendar as an example. So then that just immediately blocks off the day and cancels out meetings associated with it. And depending on how severe the illness is, like if you know that there's a high potential they're going to be out for a few days, even doing that ahead of time may be valuable just from a planning perspective. You know, having that in place to say, hey, you know, if you have a really strong fever or you think that there's a likelihood that you're going to have a couple day recovery, just go ahead and set that up. And if you end up getting back to work sooner, that's great. But thinking of it in those terms.
Moving on to point 9, Eric Weiss, sorry if I pronounced your last name wrong. He says he's hearing rumblings about devs watch out if your job can be done remotely, it can be done from India. How would we encourage people that isn't going to cost people their jobs? This is a interesting question. Alan, you had some answers there. You want to localize?
Yeah, I think you know, we've addressed that because we've hired, you know, we've been remote from early on, and we've shifted from U.S. based employees to having nearshore and offshore. And I think that it really goes back to every employee really understanding their value in the company, which I think partially goes back to having clearly stated company objectives that roll all the way down to the individual, and then having regular check-ins in which they feel valued. I think that at any point, if you have an employee that doesn't feel valued, then they become scared and concerned for their job in general. And so I think that, again, if you're moving to remote, it's that much more important to regularly be checking with them and reinforcing their value in the company. And so I think it's more about addressing their insecurity and their feeling of value and worth in the company than it is about remote or not remote, et cetera. So that's my thought, and I don't know if that you know really addresses the whole concern, but at least how we've addressed it. And I know that like my onshore developers, I don't think there's a single one of them that would question whether they would be replaced with an offshore. It's more of how they're partnering with as we scale, whether we're bringing in more onshore or offshore.
Yeah, I have a little bit of a contradictory opinion here, and I don't know how to express it, so just bear with me for a second. I worked at a company that was multinational, and the expectations were is whatever you were working on, more than likely 3 years from now, you weren't working on it had been moved offshore, as an example. So it really depends on what your company culture is. Just from the perspective of, you know, we hire globally as an example, so we do expect that there are capable people in other countries that can do the job. What we're really thinking about it in terms of is what the value of the employee is bringing and how we can best support that. So yes, it is a possibility that the thing that you're working on goes to somebody else eventually, But the ideal thing is that we're having you work on some new challenge or something else that's of significant value that basically keeps you moving in that fashion to basically say, here's the next challenge I want to have. And in most cases, most software engineers that I've worked with, they actually want that new challenge after they've worked on something for a couple of years. They don't want to keep working on the same thing. So in some ways that you could almost view this as beneficial. The other aspect is I've seen cultures of companies where people think, oh, well, this is the way I can protect my job. I've never seen that work well. Loss in productivity. Like if that's the mindset, it's really almost like a negative that you really want to avoid as much as possible. So coaching individuals on saying, hey, if you're thinking in terms of this is my job protection, you probably are not thinking about the right things from that perspective. And it's a little bit more of a tough coaching conversation, but the reality is we really want them to think in terms of what value they're adding to the organization rather than looking over their shoulder. So embrace it, try to understand it, appreciate it, but also make sure they understand that, hey, that's if they're focused on that, then long term it's going to be problematic.
I just agree with Reg that I think this is going to be a tipping point for how we operate. I think it'll be interesting to watch. But other than that, I think really let's all watch out for our communities and help support the idea that we want to limit the spread of coronavirus and encourage our employees to do the same, so that it doesn't become more of an outbreak than it already is. And I think that remember to support your employees' mental state and their concerns. I think there's a lot of anxiety around what's going on in communities. People have friends and family that are in high risk state, or maybe themselves. So I think making sure that you're thinking about compassion for the employee as an individual and how they're feeling and how that may affect their work, and making sure you're checking in on them, and just overall increasing communication internally, regardless of where you're at as far as going remote, I think is important right now.